Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien, where the boundaries of space, biology, and love are pushed to their limits. In today's story, we take you on an unexpected journey aboard Nexus Station, where a routine workout leads to an explosive and shocking twist. Connor Mitchell, a human diplomat, thought he was simply working up a sweat, but he had no idea that his pheromones would trigger an unforeseen biological transformation in Eleni, a Vidiian scientist, setting off a series of events that would forever alter the course of their lives. Imagine this: what starts as a strange biological reaction soon becomes a test of trust, resilience, and identity. Eleni, once in control of her species' physiology, now finds herself facing an uncontrollable transformation, a reaction triggered by something as simple as Connor's presence. But it doesn't end there. As they try to understand what's happening, they're caught in a web of political intrigue and manipulation. Unbeknownst to them, their connection was not a mere accident, it was orchestrated by powerful forces within the Vidiian High Council. As their bond grows, so do the stakes. Will their relationship survive the political scheming? Can they navigate the trials that will test their very connection, or will they be torn apart by the forces that created their bond? What if their love story wasn't as accidental as they thought? And what if, in the midst of this unforeseen transformation, their relationship becomes the key to unlocking a future that no one saw coming? Stay tuned, because the twists are just beginning. Connor Mitchell had been on Nexus Station for 6 months, serving as a human diplomat in what seemed to be an endless cycle of meetings, negotiations, and protocol. It was a job that required precision and diplomacy, skills he had honed over years of training. But as much as he had grown accustomed to the intricacies of interspecies communication, nothing could prepare him for the strange encounter that would alter the course of his life. The gym on Nexus Station was his refuge. A quiet, unassuming place where he could escape the demands of his position and focus on something as simple as the rhythm of his body moving through space. It was here, amidst the hum of distant machinery and the flicker of the station's artificial lighting, that Connor found solace. The gym was often empty during the cycles he preferred to work out, and this particular morning was no different. The weight of the day's upcoming diplomatic sessions hung heavy on his mind, and as he pushed through his final set of deadlifts, he allowed himself to slip into a state of calm focus. The sweat on his brow, the burn in his muscles, were the only things that existed in the world at that moment. His mind wandered momentarily, but the stillness of the space was broken when the pneumatic doors to the gym hissed open. A figure entered, disrupting the solitude that had enveloped him. It was Eleni, a Vidiian scientist, a species renowned throughout the galaxy for their grace, intelligence, and unwavering control over their biology. She moved with a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural, her body long and sleek, her silver hair cascading down her back like liquid light. The emerald green of her skin shimmered in the dim light, a striking contrast to the sterile gray of the station's interior. Connor nodded in her direction, offering a polite greeting, though he quickly turned his attention back to his weights. He had learned to acknowledge the other species aboard Nexus Station with respect, but interactions were often limited to formal settings. The gym, as always, was his sanctuary. He didn't expect to be drawn into another conversation, at least not here, not in this space where he could lose himself in the rhythm of his body's movement. But there was something different about Eleni. Her presence seemed to cut through the stillness of the room, demanding his attention without asking for it. She wasn't just another member of the various species that came and went on Nexus, there was an unspoken energy around her, a certain aura that made her stand out even among the most fascinating of beings that lived and worked on the station. She began her workout with the kind of ease that spoke to years of discipline. Her movements were precise, graceful, and powerful, each one flowing into the next with the kind of symmetry that only those who had mastered their own bodies could achieve. Connor found himself watching her, not out of any particular desire, but because of the quiet magnetism she exuded. He had seen her before at diplomatic functions, always composed, always focused on her work. But here, in this space of sweat and exertion, she was something entirely different. And then, as if the universe had decided to throw an unexpected curveball into an otherwise ordinary day, something happened that Connor could not have anticipated. As Eleni continued her workout, her movements began to slow. She stopped mid-motion, her body stiffening. Her chest rose and fell more rapidly, her breath shallow. Connor's brow furrowed as he noticed the subtle change in her posture. She placed a hand over her stomach, her face a mask of concentration. But there was something more beneath the surface, something unsettling. Connor put down the weights and took a few steps toward her, his concern rising. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with genuine worry. Eleni's eyes darted around the gym, her silver pupils wide with alarm. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The stillness of the room seemed to stretch longer than it should have, the silence between them becoming almost tangible. She started, but then stopped, shaking her head as though trying to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. The confusion was evident in her eyes. "Something's wrong." Connor moved closer, his military training kicking in despite the strange, surreal nature of the moment. He knew that, in situations like these, calmness was key. "Do you need medical assistance?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. But Eleni's response was swift and firm. "No, I can't explain." She seemed to fight for control, her eyes glancing down at her body as though trying to make sense of the changes happening within her. Just stay back for a moment, please." Connor stopped in his tracks, his mind racing as he watched her. His diplomatic training told him to give space when someone asked for it, but his instincts pushed him closer. Something was happening here, something beyond his understanding. Her breathing became more erratic. Her hands moved from her stomach to her chest, and then, with an alarming swiftness, they moved lower, toward her hips and backside. Connor's eyes widened as he saw her form change right before him. Her once lean, athletic body began to swell in certain areas, her chest visibly expanding beneath her workout gear, and more dramatically, her hips and buttocks shifting into fuller, more curvaceous shapes. It was as though her very physiology was reacting to something invisible, something that only she could sense. "Holy," Connor muttered under his breath, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. His first instinct was to look away, but something about the vulnerability in her expression kept him rooted to the spot. "Eleni," he called gently, his voice full of concern. "What's happening to you?" Eleni's eyes met his, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. It's a biological response," she managed, her voice strained. "Your pheromones, they triggered something in me." Connor felt his heart race as the pieces began to fall into place. He had studied xenobiology during his training, but nothing had prepared him for something like this. The way she spoke about pheromones, about their shared biology, he realized, with growing discomfort, that this wasn't just a physiological reaction. It was personal. It was intimate. "My sweat triggered this?" he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. His mind raced, but there was no immediate answer. Eleni looked at him, a sense of helplessness crossing her features. "Yes," she said quietly. "Something in your scent." It triggered my reproductive cycle. It's not supposed to happen this way. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. A mixture of fascination and unease washed over Connor as he took a step back. This was something far beyond their control. What started as a routine workout, something Connor had done countless times before, had now become a turning point, a moment that neither of them could ignore. Connor found himself struggling to reconcile the strange new reality with the logical, diplomatic world he had come to know. What was happening here? What did this mean for their relationship, if it could even be called that? And why had his simple human presence caused such an intense reaction in Eleni? But in that moment, as the air between them thickened with confusion and vulnerability, something else emerged, an undeniable connection. Despite the bewildering circumstances, despite the unexpectedness of it all, Connor knew one thing for certain: this was the beginning of something much greater than either of them could have ever expected. And so, their story began, not with plans or preparations, but with an accident, an accidental bond, and the complexity of two beings whose paths were about to collide in ways neither of them could have foreseen. As Eleni stood frozen in the gym, her breathing becoming more erratic, Connor felt a surge of panic rise within him. His training had prepared him for political crises, for negotiation, for cultural misunderstandings, but nothing had prepared him for this. There was a stillness in the air that felt heavy, as though the laws of nature themselves had been temporarily suspended. The gym, which had always been a quiet refuge, had suddenly become the epicenter of something far beyond his comprehension. Eleni's discomfort deepened, and Connor could see her struggle to maintain control. The graceful movements she had exhibited just moments before now seemed rigid, almost unnatural. She pressed a hand against her midsection, her silver eyes darting around the gym as though searching for an explanation that simply wasn't there. The calm and collected scientist he had known was now lost, replaced by someone who seemed caught in the throes of an internal battle. "Are you okay?" Connor asked softly, his voice betraying the concern he felt but hadn't known how to express. Eleni didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed like she was trying to regain control of herself, trying to find the words to explain what was happening inside her. But nothing came. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. And then, the changes began. Connor's eyes widened as he watched Eleni's form shift before him. Her body, which had always been sleek and athletic, began to change. Slowly at first, but then with increasing speed, as if her very physiology was responding to something far deeper than simple biological needs. Her chest began to swell beneath her workout top, the fabric straining against the rapid expansion. Her hips widened, the curve of her body becoming more pronounced, her athletic frame turning into something rounder, fuller, more feminine. Connor stood frozen, unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. His mind raced for an explanation, but nothing came. He had studied xenobiology, had prepared for many potential cultural and biological anomalies when working with species as diverse as the Vidiians, but this was something entirely different. This was a response beyond the realms of anything he had ever encountered. "Holy," he muttered under his breath, unable to tear his eyes away from the sight. His voice trembled as he struggled to understand what was happening. What's going on?" Eleni's body continued to change, the transformation unfolding in real time. It wasn't just her physical form that was altering, it was as though her very essence was being reshaped. Her once toned physique had bloomed into something completely different, her body now resembling a hyperfeminine ideal, more exaggerated and pronounced in ways that were entirely unexpected. The tightness of her shorts now felt like an absurdity, the fabric struggling to contain her new proportions. Despite the obvious discomfort she was in, Eleni's expression shifted into one of profound confusion and panic. She looked down at her body in disbelief, as though she were seeing herself for the first time, as though her own flesh had become alien to her. Her hands moved over her body as if trying to steady the changes, but there was nothing she could do to halt the tide of her transformation. The shift was so dramatic, so sudden, that it left her physically breathless, a mix of astonishment and dread settling over her features. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This shouldn't be happening." Connor stepped forward, his voice gentle yet insistent. "What is it? What's happening to you?" It's a biological response," Eleni finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would somehow make the situation more real, more overwhelming. "Your pheromones, your scent, it triggered something inside me." Her eyes met his then, wide with disbelief and vulnerability. "This isn't supposed to happen like this." Connor's heart thudded heavily in his chest. Her words rang in his ears, but their meaning didn't immediately register. "Triggered something? What do you mean?" he asked, still not understanding the full scope of what was occurring. "The reproductive cycle," Eleni said, her voice strained as she tried to steady her breathing. "It's a response that happens only under certain conditions, but it's never been triggered like this before. Not spontaneously. Not by something so simple." Her gaze dropped to the sweat still glistening on Connor's chest, and there was a hint of shame in her eyes as she finally connected the dots. "It's your pheromones, human male pheromones. They're similar to the mating signals of my species. And somehow, they've triggered this response in me." Connor stood still, his mind racing to catch up with what Eleni was saying. Her reproductive cycle, triggered by his sweat. The idea was almost impossible to process. He had known that different species responded to pheromones differently, but this was beyond anything he had ever read about, beyond anything he had imagined. "You mean, my sweat? It's causing this?" he asked, his voice quiet, as though testing the idea to see if it would make any more sense the second time he said it. "Yes," Eleni confirmed, her voice barely audible. She looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting both embarrassment and disbelief. "It's not something I could control. Not something I even knew could happen." She took a step back, trying to distance herself from the change, as if the physical transformation had somehow also broken the emotional distance she had always maintained. "I had no idea," Connor whispered, his heart racing. The implications of what was happening were starting to hit him. He had come to Nexus Station as a diplomat, thinking his role was simply to navigate the cultural and political nuances between humans and the alien species who called Nexus home. But now, his mere presence, his sweat, had triggered an unimaginable biological reaction in a species so advanced and controlled that spontaneous biological responses were thought to be impossible. He tried to take a step closer, but Eleni quickly raised her hand, her eyes wide with concern. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Please, just let me figure this out." Connor immediately stopped, realizing the weight of the situation. This wasn't just some random accident. What was happening between them had created a ripple effect, something both biological and emotional. Eleni, though she tried to maintain control, was now struggling with a deep sense of vulnerability. This wasn't something she could easily explain away. It wasn't something either of them could control. But beyond the biological confusion, there was something else, a subtle connection beginning to form between them, something more than the simple mechanics of their species. As Connor stood there, watching Eleni's physical transformation unfold, he realized that this moment, this accident, was creating something deeper. Something that, despite the embarrassment, was forging a bond neither of them had anticipated. Their lives, their destinies, were being shaped in real time by forces beyond their control. The pheromones, the sweat, had triggered something profound. But what would this mean for them? And what would it mean for their relationship, one that had started with simple politeness and mutual respect, and now was evolving into something far more complicated? As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the gym became a silent witness to the unexpected and profoundly personal shift occurring between Connor and Eleni. The change in Eleni's body had started with an alarming transformation, one that was both physical and biological in nature. But as the initial shock began to wear off, the emotional complexity of their situation started to emerge. Connor could sense it in the air between them, a tension neither of them had anticipated. His initial concern for her well-being shifted, gradually, into a quiet realization that this was not just about the physical changes she had endured. There was something deeper unfolding, something profound, something that neither of them had prepared for. The bond that had been formed between them in the most unexpected of ways was beginning to take shape, not just through physical attraction but through shared vulnerability and the unspoken understanding of what it meant to navigate this moment together. Eleni's eyes, which had been wide with confusion and embarrassment, now softened, though her discomfort was still palpable. Her breath had evened out, and though her body had returned to some semblance of normalcy, there was an undeniable shift in the energy between them. She wasn't the composed, controlled scientist he had first encountered, she was now someone raw, unguarded, and, in a strange way, human in her vulnerability. It was a vulnerability that, in any other context, would have been deeply private, but now, it was something they shared. Connor stood there, feeling an unspoken pull between them. He had never expected to feel so deeply connected to someone so quickly. But then, in the midst of the disarray, it became clear, despite the alien nature of her species, despite the shocking transformation that had taken place, there was something undeniably human in Eleni. She had opened herself up to him in a way that transcended species, and in that quiet moment, Connor felt the weight of her trust. It wasn't just about what had happened to her body. It was about what had happened to her, about what was unfolding between them, against all odds. When Eleni spoke again, her voice was softer, more tentative than before, but still firm with resolve. "I didn't want this to happen like this," she said, her gaze shifting downward, almost ashamed. "I didn't want you to see me this way, not like this. It's not how I imagined meeting someone, not someone like you." Connor's heart ached at her words. He could feel the rawness in her voice, the fear that her vulnerability would drive a wedge between them. But in that moment, Connor realized something vital. It wasn't her body, her transformation, or even the strange biological response that had formed the bond between them. It was the trust, the connection that had emerged in the wake of something neither of them had chosen. It was the understanding that, despite the differences between them, human and Vidiian, diplomat and scientist, they were now tethered together by something far stronger than physicality or fate. They had shared a deeply intimate experience, and that intimacy went beyond the surface. "You didn't have control over this, Eleni," Connor said, his voice steady yet filled with compassion. "None of this was your fault, and you don't need to apologize for it. We're here now. This thing between us, it's real. And I don't think that's something either of us can just ignore." His words hung in the air, and as he spoke, he watched her eyes soften, the tension in her posture easing just slightly. There was a quiet power in their shared moment, one that neither of them had anticipated but both felt deeply. It was a bond forged not in the convenience of circumstance or the allure of the unknown, but in the deep, unspoken recognition of what they were facing. And in that moment, they saw each other not as human and Vidiian, not as diplomat and scientist, but as two individuals who had, in some strange twist of fate, been thrust together in a way that could not be undone. Eleni looked up at him, her eyes searching his, almost as if she was afraid to truly meet his gaze, afraid of what she might see. But when she did, there was no judgment there, no disappointment. Only understanding. The vulnerability she had experienced, though momentarily shocking, had broken down the walls she had so carefully built, and in its place, there was something new, something that felt like hope, even if it was fragile. "I didn't expect this," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think it would feel like this. I thought I could control it. But now," she shook her head, the words catching in her throat. "Now, I don't know what's happening anymore. It's like everything's shifting around me, and I don't know if I can stop it." Connor stepped forward, his hands held out, palms open in a gesture of understanding. He didn't have all the answers, he didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her go through this alone. "Eleni," he said, his voice soft but steady, "you don't have to control everything. Not now, not with me. Whatever this is, whatever happens, we're in this together. You're not alone." For a long moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was quiet, almost sacred, as they both processed the enormity of the situation. There was no easy explanation, no clear solution to the complexity of their bond. But in that silence, they both knew that something had changed. They had crossed a threshold. Their connection, which had begun with an unexpected biological response, had deepened into something that neither of them could have predicted. And yet, as much as their physical connection had been thrust upon them, the emotional connection had been something they had both chosen. In that moment of shared vulnerability, they had made a choice, not to run, not to pull away, but to stand together. It was in this shared experience, this new understanding between them, that the real bond had formed. Eleni slowly stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. Her movements, though still tentative, were more confident now, as if she were finally allowing herself to embrace the connection that had been forged between them. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I want to find out. With you." Connor nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of awe and affection. "I think I do too," he replied. And for the first time since their encounter, there was a sense of peace between them, a sense that whatever came next, they would face it together. In the midst of uncertainty, in the face of the bizarre and unexpected, they had found something real. It was raw, imperfect, and unplanned, but it was theirs. And it was the start of something neither of them had ever imagined. The days that followed Eleni's sudden transformation were marked by a strange mix of tension and quiet understanding. What had begun as an accidental biological response, a physical reaction triggered by something as simple as Connor's sweat, had evolved into something far more profound. Neither of them could have predicted that their brief encounter in the gym would lead to a connection that transcended species, culture, and the boundaries they once thought they understood. But now, as they navigated the complexities of their bond, they both realized that the stakes had grown far higher than either of them could have anticipated. Eleni, who had once prided herself on her control over her work, her biology, and even her emotions, found herself grappling with something she could neither control nor explain. The changes in her body had not only been a shock, but they had forced her to confront the reality that her carefully constructed world was not as solid as she had believed. For the first time, she felt vulnerable, exposed, and yet, in the presence of Connor, she found a strange sense of comfort. There was no judgment in his eyes, no fear, or hesitation. He was here, standing by her side, not as an observer of her transformation but as someone who was equally caught in the wake of it. And it was this shared vulnerability that had started to bind them in ways that felt both frightening and beautiful. Connor, for his part, was equally affected. His role as a diplomat had always been one of careful calculation, of navigating complex cultural exchanges and political negotiations. But now, faced with the raw, uncharted terrain of his own emotions, he found himself questioning everything he had ever known about connection. He had entered Nexus Station as a stranger to most of the species there, a mere observer of the intricate dance of intergalactic politics. Now, however, he was part of something much more intimate and complex than any diplomatic mission he had ever undertaken. He was learning, for the first time, that true understanding could not be achieved through words alone. Sometimes, it required shared experiences, even the most difficult and unexpected ones. As they sat together, the weight of the days pressing on them, Eleni spoke of the next step. The trials of compatibility, a series of tests designed by her people to measure the bond between two beings, had been something she had learned about as a child. Her species, known for their intellectual and emotional sophistication, had developed these trials as a way of ensuring that two individuals who formed a bond, especially a biological one, were truly compatible. It was more than just a physical union, it was a way of testing the depth of understanding and emotional resonance between the two. For Eleni, the trials had always seemed theoretical, a distant concept rooted in ancient traditions. But now, as she stood on the precipice of something she couldn't control, the trials were no longer abstract. They were a real and tangible test of everything she and Connor had come to share, for better or for worse. "We need to do this," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet determination that surprised even her. "The trials will help us understand whether what we have is real or just the result of some unforeseen biological coincidence. We can't leave it to chance. We owe it to ourselves to know." Connor looked at her, his gaze soft yet intense, as though trying to read her, trying to understand not just what she was saying but what she was feeling. "You're right," he agreed, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "But I don't want to do this just because we have to. I want to do this because I believe in what we've started. And I believe in you." For the first time since they had met, Eleni allowed herself to show a small, fleeting smile. It was a smile full of both relief and uncertainty, relief that Connor had not backed away from the challenge, and uncertainty because she, too, wasn't sure what the trials would reveal. She had always prided herself on her intellectual understanding, on her ability to keep her emotions in check. But now, standing beside Connor, she realized that there was no way to prepare for what they were about to face. This was new territory for them both, and they would have to rely on each other in ways that neither had ever imagined. The trials began the following day, in a ceremonial chamber on Nexus Station, a place reserved for rituals of great significance. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the lighting was dim, casting long shadows against the walls. The space was designed to create an atmosphere of contemplation, of deep introspection. As Connor and Eleni entered the room, the silence between them felt both comforting and suffocating, as though they were about to embark on a journey that would change the course of their lives forever. The first trial was a physical one. They were asked to synchronize their movements, to move together as though their bodies were one. The challenge was simple in concept but difficult in execution. It was not just about performing physical tasks in harmony, it was about creating a deep, intuitive connection, a shared understanding that transcended words or conscious thought. As they stood on the circular platform, the floor lit up with a pattern of lights, and a soft, rhythmic sound began to fill the room. It was as though the very space around them had come alive, urging them to move in time with each other. At first, the movements were awkward, unsure. Connor and Eleni tried to mirror each other's steps, but their bodies were not yet attuned. The music quickened, the lights pulsing in time with the beat, and Connor's heart raced as he struggled to follow her lead. But then, something began to shift. As he focused on Eleni, on the fluidity of her movements, he began to sense her rhythm, her breath, her energy. It was no longer about conscious effort, it was about connecting, about becoming aware of each other in a way that was both physical and emotional. And then it happened. Their movements aligned, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. The rhythm between them became effortless, almost instinctual. Connor's hand brushed Eleni's, and for a moment, the world outside the chamber seemed to fade away. There was no longer any uncertainty, no confusion. There was just them, moving as one, synchronized in a way that felt both natural and transcendent. When the trial ended, neither of them spoke immediately. They stood there, their breathing heavy, their bodies still connected by the lingering energy of the trial. In that silence, they both understood something. They had passed the first trial, but more than that, they had shared something that went beyond the physical. They had created a bond that neither could deny. The next trials, both mental and emotional, were equally challenging. They were forced to confront their deepest fears, their vulnerabilities, and their desires. Each test pushed them further, drawing out emotions that neither of them had been prepared to confront. They shared memories of their pasts, of their cultures, of their beliefs, and through it all, they discovered that their connection was not just about biology or the physical, it was about understanding, about seeing each other for who they truly were, without the barriers of species or cultural expectations. As the final trial came to a close, they stood before each other, changed in ways neither had anticipated. The trials had tested them, yes, but they had also revealed something far more important. They were not just compatible on a biological level. They were compatible in ways that mattered more deeply, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. Connor took Eleni's hand in his voice steady but filled with awe. "We've made it through this, together," he said quietly. "And no matter what happens next, I know one thing, I want to keep going. I want to keep moving forward with you." Eleni met his gaze, her silver eyes filled with a quiet strength. "I feel the same," she replied, her voice soft yet resolute. "This bond, it's real. And no matter where it takes us, I know we're ready for whatever comes next." And with that, they knew that their journey together was only just beginning. The trials had not only proven their compatibility, they had proven the depth of their connection. What began as an unexpected biological response had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted, but both of them were now fully prepared to embrace. Together. The tension that had settled between Connor and Eleni in the wake of the trials of compatibility was not one of discomfort, but of quiet understanding. It was the kind of bond that was forged in the crucible of unexpected events and shared vulnerability. The connection between them had grown stronger with each passing moment, each challenge they faced together. But just as they had begun to settle into this new reality, a revelation, one that neither of them had expected, shattered the fragile peace they had started to build. The morning after the final trial, when the bond between them was still fresh and raw, the air aboard Nexus Station seemed strangely still. The hum of the station's systems was quieter than usual, the usual buzz of interspecies interaction subdued. It was in this quiet that Eleni received an unexpected message, a message that sent a chill down her spine and sent her heart racing in a way she had not felt in years. A delegation of high-ranking Vidiian officials was waiting for her in the station's diplomatic chamber. Eleni's instincts, honed over years of experience, immediately told her that something was off. She had not been briefed about any official meetings, and the urgency of the summons hinted at something far more pressing. It wasn't just a routine diplomatic engagement, there was something personal about it, something that involved her directly. Connor, who had been by her side through every step of their journey together, could sense the change in her demeanor. He knew that whatever was happening now was different. He had seen the way Eleni's face had paled as she read the message, the way her silver eyes had hardened with a sudden, unspoken realization. It was as though the weight of something long hidden was about to be revealed. "I have to go," Eleni said, her voice tied with a mixture of apprehension and determination. She stood up from where they had been sitting, her hand resting briefly on the console in front of her. "They're calling me in. It's the High Council. They want to see me." Connor stood, his heart sinking as he realized that this was no ordinary meeting. The Vidiian High Council was one of the most powerful political bodies in the galaxy, and their decisions were not made lightly. He had never seen Eleni so on edge, so distant. There was a hidden tension in her movements, as though something was weighing heavily on her, something she had not shared with him. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with concern. He had stood by her side through every trial, every challenge, and he was not about to back away now, especially when it seemed like she was about to face something that could change everything. Eleni hesitated, her gaze flicking to him briefly before looking away. "No," she said softly, almost regretfully. This is something I have to do alone." And so, with a heavy heart, Connor watched as Eleni left their quarters, her figure disappearing down the hall, swallowed by the vastness of the station. He had no idea what awaited her, but a gnawing sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Something had changed, and the direction of their journey was about to take a sharp turn, one that neither of them had anticipated. When Eleni entered the diplomatic chamber, she was greeted by the imposing figures of the Vidiian officials who had been waiting for her. Their presence was commanding, their expressions unreadable. At the center of the group stood one figure she knew well, Vidiian, the High Counselor of the Vidiian people. His tall, imposing figure was dressed in the ceremonial robes of his office, and his cold gaze locked onto Eleni as she approached. "Eleni," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of authority. "You're late." "I didn't know I was expected, High Counselor," Eleni replied, her voice steady but her heart pounding in her chest. "I wasn't informed of any urgent meetings." Vidiian's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression betraying nothing. "This is not a meeting of your making. It's a matter of great importance, one that concerns you and your actions. You have been called here to answer for what you've done." Eleni's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air between them, the coldness of the situation settling into her bones. She had always known that her position within the Vidiian society came with responsibility, but she had never anticipated being called to account for her personal life, especially not for something as personal as the bond she had formed with Connor. The bond you share with the human diplomat, Connor Mitchell, Vidiian continued, his tone flat but tinged with a sharp edge. It was not an accident, was it? Eleni's mind reeled as she tried to grasp what he was implying. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vidiian's gaze turned cold, his voice heavy with implication. We've known from the beginning that this bond was not a mere coincidence. It was orchestrated, Eleni. The pheromones, the biological response, it was all part of a larger plan, a plan to test the compatibility between our species and the humans. And you were chosen to be the vessel for this experiment. Eleni's chest tightened as the full weight of his words sank in. She had suspected that something was off from the very beginning, but she had never allowed herself to consider the possibility that her bond with Connor was part of a carefully constructed scheme. The idea that her most intimate experience had been manipulated by the Vidiian High Council was a blow she was not prepared for. You knew? She asked, her voice cracking. You knew this would happen? And you let it happen. Vidiian didn't respond immediately, his gaze piercing as he regarded her. Finally, he spoke, his voice colder than ever. This was necessary, Eleni. The bond you've formed with Connor is the key to unlocking the future of our people's integration with the humans. This was never about you or him. This was always about politics. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleni felt the ground beneath her shift, her sense of self faltering in the face of this revelation. She had believed that the bond between her and Connor was something real, something meaningful. But now, it felt like a cruel game, a puppet string pulled by unseen hands. We need you to understand this, Eleni, Vidiian said, his tone softer now, but no less firm. The bond has created a new reality, one that cannot be undone. It's not just about your emotions or your desires. It's about the future of both our species. Eleni's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she processed the enormity of what Vidiian was saying. Her body had been manipulated. Her relationship with Connor had been orchestrated. It had all been a test, a political maneuver masked as a personal connection. And yet, in the midst of this manipulation, she couldn't deny the emotions that had grown between her and Connor. For a moment, she felt as though she might crumble under the weight of the truth. But then, something inside her stirred, a flicker of defiance, a spark of something that refused to be extinguished. No, she said, her voice steady now, despite the fury that burned in her chest. I won't be part of this anymore. My bond with Connor is real, and it's not a tool for political gain. If you want to use it for your agendas, you'll have to go through me. Vidiian's expression flickered, a brief flash of something like surprise crossing his face. But before he could respond, Eleni turned and walked out of the chamber, her heart pounding, her mind clear for the first time. She wasn't a pawn in their game. She was a person, with her own desires, her own choices. And she would not allow anyone to take that from her, not even the High Council. As she stepped into the corridor, Eleni knew one thing for certain, she had to face this truth head-on. But more importantly, she knew that she wasn't alone. Connor was out there, and together, they would fight for what was theirs, no matter what the Vidiian High Council had planned. The weight of the revelation hung over Eleni long after she left the Vidiian High Council's chamber. The very foundation of what she had come to believe about herself, about the bond she had formed with Connor, had been shattered in an instant. Her most intimate, personal experience had been reduced to nothing more than a political tool in a grand scheme she had not consented to. The thought of being manipulated, of having her feelings treated as mere pawns in a political game, left her breathless with anger. But more than that, it left her feeling lost. She had always prided herself on her intellectual control, her ability to make sense of complex situations. But now, in the face of this betrayal, the world she had carefully constructed was crumbling. As she walked through the corridors of Nexus Station, the weight of the words she had heard from Thean echoed in her mind. She had been chosen, selected as the vessel for a larger experiment to test human Vidiian compatibility. It wasn't real, it was never real. Her bond with Connor, the connection that had grown so deep between them, had been manipulated from the start. But even as the anger bubbled up inside her, something else began to take shape, a quiet defiance, a spark of strength that refused to be extinguished. Eleni wasn't going to let them take this from her. She wasn't going to let her relationship with Connor be twisted into something it wasn't. Thean, the High Council, the very political system that had once felt like a guiding force in her life, it all seemed distant now, like a hollow echo of a world that no longer fit her. Her steps quickened as she made her way back to their quarters, her mind spinning. Connor had been waiting for her, unsure of what had transpired but knowing something was wrong. When she entered the room, he stood up immediately, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of concern and curiosity. He had never seen her like this before, so fierce, so determined, yet so vulnerable. Eleni, what happened? What did they say? Connor asked, his voice gentle but urgent. She stopped for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe as she struggled to find the words. The rawness of the situation threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to speak, to articulate the truth that had just been revealed. They knew, she said quietly, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. They knew all along. Our bond, it was never an accident. It was orchestrated. She cut herself off, her chest rising and falling with a heavy breath. They used me, Connor. Used us. Connor's expression hardened, the intensity of her words settling deep within him. He had known from the beginning that there was something strange about their connection, something beyond the physical. But hearing her say it, hearing her reveal the depths of the manipulation, made his blood boil. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching her. He didn't need to ask for more details. The pain in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. We can't just let them do this to us, he said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of resolve. You don't have to face this alone. We're in this together, Eleni. The words, simple as they were, resonated with her more than she could have expected. They were the same words he had said to her in the gym, in the trials, when everything was uncertain. They were the words that had kept her grounded in the midst of the chaos, the words that had allowed her to open her heart to him. And now, in the face of this revelation, they meant even more. They weren't just words of comfort, they were a promise. A promise that, no matter what happened next, they would face it side by side. Eleni's eyes softened, the anger in them giving way to a flicker of hope. She met Connor's gaze, her silver eyes filled with determination. You're right, she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. We can't let them control us. We can't let them turn our feelings into a game, into something they can manipulate for their own gain. This bond, this connection, it's real. And we have to fight for it. For us. Connor nodded, his heart swelling with pride. This was the Eleni he had come to know, the one who, even in the face of overwhelming odds, refused to back down. He had seen her strength, her intellect, her determination, but now he saw something more, a vulnerability that, far from weakening her, made her even stronger. "We will," he said, his voice unwavering. "We'll fight for what's ours. And we'll do it together. I'll stand by you, no matter what." For the first time since they had learned the truth, Eleni allowed herself to believe in that promise. The path ahead was unclear, and the obstacles they would face were greater than anything they had yet encountered. But she knew, without a doubt, that she wasn't alone. Connor was with her, and together, they could face whatever came next. The decision was made. They weren't going to be pawns in a political game. They were going to take control of their own future. They would expose the High Council's manipulation and show them that their bond, this bond between human and Vidiian, was more than just an experiment. It was something worth fighting for. And in that fight, they would prove that the strength of their connection could not be undone by politics or power. As they prepared for what was to come, Eleni and Connor knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. They would face opposition, both from within their own species and from those who saw their relationship as a threat to the status quo. But as they stood together, facing the unknown, they knew that they were no longer just individuals caught in the crossfire of intergalactic politics. They were partners, united in their defiance, and their bond was a force that could not be broken. For the first time, Eleni allowed herself to feel hope. It was a fragile thing, born from the ashes of betrayal and manipulation, but it was there. And with Connor by her side, she knew that they could face anything, together. The power of choice had always been hers, but now, it wasn't just about choosing to fight, it was about choosing to live on her own terms, to refuse to let anyone else decide her fate. And in that moment, she realized that, no matter the challenges they would face, she and Connor had already won the most important battle, the battle to choose their own path, together. In the aftermath of their decision to stand together, united in defiance of the forces that sought to manipulate their bond, Eleni and Connor found themselves at a crossroads. The revelation of the Vidiian High Council's hidden agenda had shaken them both to the core. The bond they had shared, once thought to be a spontaneous connection, was now revealed to be a carefully orchestrated plan designed to test the compatibility of their species. But despite the betrayal, despite the manipulation, something deep and undeniable had formed between them, something that went far beyond politics or biology. Now, with their path ahead uncertain and fraught with challenges, they had made a choice. They would fight for what they had, for the love that had blossomed between them, against all odds. And in doing so, they would challenge not just the systems that sought to control them, but the very idea that their connection could be reduced to nothing more than a political experiment. The decision to fight wasn't easy. It meant confronting not only the powerful forces of the Vidiian High Council but also the deep-seated prejudices and beliefs that govern the interactions between their species. The Vidiians had long believed in their superiority, in the idea that their culture, their biology, and their ways of life were above reproach. And humans, while welcomed into the galactic community, were still seen by some as lesser, their ways of life primitive and unpredictable. Their union, a human and a Vidiian, was an anomaly, a violation of the established order. For Connor and Eleni, that meant they were fighting not just for their love, but for the right to define it on their own terms. In the days that followed, as they began to prepare for the confrontation with the High Council, Eleni and Connor spent more time together, reflecting on their journey thus far. They talked about the trials they had endured, the connection they had discovered, and the love that had grown from the chaos of their initial meeting. They spoke of their hopes for the future, not just for themselves, but for their people, for their species. They both knew that the outcome of their struggle would not just impact their lives, it would send ripples through the fabric of interspecies relations, challenging long-held beliefs and forcing others to reconsider what was possible. Despite the heaviness of their task, there was a quiet strength between them, a bond that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The trials had tested them, yes, but in a way, they had brought them closer, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They had faced their vulnerabilities, their deepest fears, and they had come out the other side stronger for it. And now, standing side by side, they were ready to face whatever came next. Their love, which had begun with a simple encounter in the gym, had grown into something far greater than either of them had expected. It was no longer just a reaction to pheromones or a biological response, it had transcended those limitations and become something real, something deep and lasting. It was a love that defied the boundaries of species, of culture, of expectations. It was a love that was theirs, a love that belonged to no one but them. And yet, as they prepared to take on the High Council, they were aware of the risks they were facing. They knew that the forces arrayed against them were powerful, too powerful for any one person, let alone two people caught in the midst of something so unprecedented. But they also knew that their bond, their love, was stronger than any political system, any cultural norm, any law that sought to keep them apart. It was something that couldn't be dictated by others. It was something they had to fight for. The days leading up to their confrontation with the council were filled with strategy, planning, and quiet moments of reflection. Connor and Eleni spoke little of the details of their plan, but in the silence between them, they both understood the enormity of what they were about to do. They would face the council, not as diplomats or officials, but as individuals, as partners, bound together by something that could not be undone. When the day arrived, the tension was palpable. The chamber where the High Council convened was stark, its walls lined with ancient symbols and elaborate artifacts that spoke to the long history of the Vidiian people. As Connor and Eleni entered the chamber, the weight of the moment settled over them. The council, seated in their imposing chairs, regarded them with cold, calculating eyes. But there was something different in the air today, something charged, something that neither the council nor the station could ignore. Eleni, Theon's voice echoed through the chamber, you stand before us now, not as a scientist, not as a member of the High Council, but as someone who has defied the very nature of our traditions. You have formed a bond with a human, something that is both unnatural and unprecedented. And now, you seek to have that bond recognized as legitimate. Eleni stood tall, her silver eyes unwavering, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. I stand here not as a tool of your political machinations, but as a woman who has found something real, something that cannot be denied, no matter how hard you try to manipulate it. The bond between Connor and I is not just a scientific experiment. It is not just a biological anomaly. It is a connection that transcends species, that goes beyond the superficial differences that have divided us for centuries. It is real. And it is ours. Connor stepped forward, his presence a quiet strength beside her. We are not here to play your political games, he said, his voice steady. We are here to fight for what's ours. For the love that we share. And we will not let anyone take that away from us. Theon's eyes flashed with something, anger, frustration, perhaps even fear, but he quickly masked it with his usual stoic demeanor. You speak of love, but love is not enough to change the course of history. The integration of species, the future of our people, it is all built on the foundation of power. And power, Eleni, Power is not something that can be swayed by emotions. But Eleni was undeterred. Power does not define us, she said, her voice rising with emotion. What defines us is our ability to choose. Our ability to live as we see fit, to love as we see fit. No one, not even you, can take that away from us. As the tension in the room mounted, it became clear that the High Council's position was not one they would easily be able to shift. But Eleni and Connor knew something that the Council did not. They knew that love was a force far more powerful than politics, than power, than tradition. It was a force that had the ability to change the very fabric of their world, to break down the walls that had separated species for millennia. In that moment, as they stood together before the Council, Eleni and Connor knew that they had already won. The Council may have held the power in that room, but it was their love that had already changed everything. The path ahead was uncertain, the battles yet to be fought, but one thing was clear: they were no longer bound by the limits that others had set for them. They were free, and they would face whatever came next, together. Their love had defied the boundaries of species, of tradition, of politics. And in doing so, it had become something unstoppable. Something that would change the galaxy forever. Together, they would fight for the future they had chosen, one built on trust, on respect, and on a love that could never be erased. The journey that had begun so unexpectedly, under the most improbable of circumstances, had brought Connor and Eleni to a place neither of them could have foreseen. What started as a simple diplomatic mission on Nexus Station, a routine assignment filled with the complexities of interspecies relations, had slowly and inevitably transformed into something far more personal, far more profound. Their paths had crossed not by chance but by the pull of forces neither could control, and it was that very lack of control that had given rise to something that defied every expectation, something real, something true. In the beginning, neither of them had understood the full implications of their meeting. For Eleni, a scientist who had long prided herself on her logical mind and ability to control her own biology, the unexpected transformation she underwent after Connor's simple presence had thrown her world into disarray. For Connor, a human diplomat who had always relied on rationality and diplomacy, the sudden and intense bond that formed between him and Eleni felt like a disruption to everything he knew about relationships, about power, and about what it meant to truly understand another being. But despite the confusion, despite the shock, there had been a quiet understanding that grew between them, a recognition that something deeper than biology was at play. They had been forced to face their vulnerabilities, their fears, and their differences head-on. In doing so, they found strength in each other, an undeniable connection that transcended the biological and the political. This connection wasn't just about human pheromones or the manipulation of species' natural responses. It wasn't about what the Vidiian High Council had intended or the trials they had been forced to undergo. It was about the bond that had been forged between them, something that existed in the quiet moments of shared vulnerability, in the rawness of their emotions, in the strength of their choice to stand together. What had started as a moment of vulnerability in a gym had become a battle for autonomy, for self-determination, and for the right to choose their own path in a world that had tried to dictate their lives. The political forces that had conspired to manipulate their bonds saw it only as an experiment, a tool to further their own agendas. But Connor and Eleni, in their courage and defiance, had shown that their bond was not to be used or manipulated. It was theirs, and theirs alone. In a galaxy filled with power struggles and ancient traditions, they had dared to stand up and say that love was more than just biology or politics. Love was a force that could break down walls, that could transcend boundaries and defy the very systems that sought to keep them apart. As they faced the High Council, the tension in the room was palpable. The Council, a group of the most powerful political figures in the galaxy, regarded them with cold, calculating eyes. But despite the weight of their authority, there was something different in the air that day. Eleni and Connor were no longer the vulnerable beings they had once been. They were no longer mere pawns in a game they didn't understand. They were standing together, as equals, with the full knowledge that their bond, however it had started, was something sacred, something that couldn't be undone. Eleni, who had once felt the weight of her species' expectations bearing down on her, now stood before the council with a quiet confidence. She no longer felt the need to apologize for her feelings, for the connection she had with Connor. She had learned that love was not something to be ashamed of, something to hide. It was a strength, not a weakness. And with that understanding came the realization that she no longer had to play by the rules of a system that sought to control her every move. The very nature of her being, her intellect, her identity, her feelings, was not to be dictated by anyone, not even by the council that had once held so much power over her. Connor, too, had changed. He had come to Nexus Station as a diplomat, someone trained to navigate the complexities of intergalactic relations. But through Eleni, he had learned that diplomacy wasn't just about negotiations and agreements. It was about understanding, about recognizing the humanity, or, in this case, the sentience and emotion, of those you interacted with. He had always seen himself as a bridge between species, someone who could unite cultures. But now, with Eleni by his side, he understood that real unity came from something deeper than agreements or treaties. It came from shared experience, from empathy, from love. And so, as they stood before the High Council, Eleni and Connor knew that they had already won. They had proven that their connection was real, that it could not be denied by politics or power. They had shown that love could break down the walls that divided species, that it could transcend the forces that sought to control them. The Council, though they may have been the most powerful figures in the galaxy, could no longer dictate the terms of Eleni and Connor's relationship. They had chosen each other, and nothing, not even the most entrenched political system, could take that away from them. But the journey didn't end there. It couldn't. The battle they had fought had only just begun, and the challenges they would face in the future were still unknown. They knew that their love, as powerful as it was, would not be enough to change everything overnight. There would be others who would fight against them, others who would seek to undo the progress they had made. But Eleni and Connor understood now that it didn't matter how long the road was or how difficult the journey became. What mattered was that they had chosen it together. Their love had changed them, transformed them in ways they hadn't imagined. It had shown them that true strength came not from power or control, but from the courage to stand together in the face of adversity. And as they walked forward, hand in hand, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Their journey had changed everything, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed it, for every species that had seen what was possible when love was allowed to flourish, unfettered by politics or biology. They had shown that true connection was not about what divided them, but about what united them. And in doing so, they had begun to change the galaxy, one choice, one bond, one moment of love at a time. As they looked toward the future, Eleni and Connor knew that the path ahead would be filled with uncertainty. But it was a path they would walk together, knowing that the most profound journey of all was the one they had already started, the journey of love, defying boundaries, and creating something new, something lasting, something that would change everything.